right at the top to thank UNICEF for their kind support of this event. Thank you. I was thinking about how to introduce the session, and I did wonder if our title was a little bit dry. So I'm hoping not, but I'm also going to work to try to convince you that not only is this an interesting topic, it's an extremely important one. In fact, I'm going to say it's an existential challenge for our times, to add to the list, the growing list that we have between us. On climate in the UK, it feels like we have something of a good story to tell. The government's rolling out serious action on the domestic front, and as well as reducing UK emissions, that's generating green industries, green jobs, benefiting us here in the UK. And it's also, on the international stage, helping to create a sense that a leading economy is taking the climate crisis seriously, and that's valuable. But it sometimes feels to me as if our collective focus on the UK's own transition risks us missing the bigger picture. We are one piece in the puzzle, and we won't get very far in solving the puzzle with one piece. So I wanted to reflect on where we are with the global picture. And we're really behind. So we published a report as IPPR earlier this month, which looked at the data about the transition in some global south countries. And by 2030, lots of the large global south countries will have emissions higher than us here in the UK. So that includes Argentina, Egypt, Iran, Mexico, Thailand, Turkey, Vietnam, all larger than the UK. We're also really behind with adaptation globally. So we still have hundreds of millions of people, including children, exposed to the risks of rain-fed agriculture. They're waiting for the rain to grow their crops, and without that, they're extremely exposed to climate risk. So we're behind. So what does a successful global transition require? It requires finance for green infrastructure, green energy, green transport, to reward the protection of forests and oceans. And at COP29, delegates agreed to a 1.3 trillion target in terms of mobilising climate finance to enable this transition. And so we're in the year now where the world was meant to come up with a credible roadmap to describe how these funds should be mobilised. And I hope we hear from our panellists as to what they think is likely to get us there and what steps we need to take. But from IPPR's perspective, I just wanted to highlight three things before I open up the conversation. So first, we have to get right for ourselves. If others don't take climate action, that's not their problem, it's also our problem here. Climate stress, just to give one example, is pushing up food prices in the UK. I mean, people in the UK can't take a lot more of this. We see millions of people struggling with their budgets, and it's putting pressure on our politics. So it's for us as well. Second, we've got to get this right to show we can work together as an international community. For many countries of the Global South, this is a totemic issue. Can countries like the UK, where it's transparently in their national interests to step up, manage to do so? If not, it risks playing into this feeling that the international policy space is just increasingly transactional and extractive. And then finally, there's a real opportunity here. The UK is targeting these green jobs in, wind value chains, battery value chains, heat pumps. We can do the same with finance. There's a real opportunity for the city and our wider financial sector to benefit in terms of financing the global transition. So, what should the UK do? So luckily we have an absolutely fantastic panel here to give a sense of the way forward. So to my immediate left, we have the Right Honourable Baroness Chapman of Darlington, Minister for International Development, Latin America and the Caribbean. Not anymore. Oh, go on.
Africa.
Oh, congratulations. And before she was the Minister, she was Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for this ministry, you were previously the previous Minister, and then you served as the MP for Darlington between 2010 and 2019. And then on my far left, I have Drummond, who's the founder of Sharing Strategies. I have you down as a serial advocacy entrepreneur, which is a great title. You are a global strategist for Jubilee 2000 Drop the Debt, and you co-founded Data.org and One. And with sharing strategies, Jamie's working with major foundations, MDBs, think tanks, a variety of organisations to catalyse campaigns of change. To my immediate right, I have Svetlana Onye. He's a member of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. Svetlana is a climate journalist, researcher, and climate justice advocate, and she leads the Eco Anxiety Africa project, pioneering research on the mental health impacts of climate change on African youth. She's also a director and COP working group member of the Youth UK Climate Coalition. And then finally, on my far right, Dr. Philip Goodwin is the Chief Executive Officer of the UK Committee for UNICEF, and he was previously CEO of VSO since 2015, and a tree aid, a development organisation working on agroforestry. So, I'm going to open this up to about 5-minute statements from each of our panellists on how they see the way forward. One round of questions after that, and then we'll open up to the audience for some hopefully we'll get a little bit of time at the end for people to make any final remarks. Minister, can we hear your perspective? Jenny, can we hear your perspective on how the UK can show up in the climate finance space? How do we leverage its full set of tools? And what's going to stop us?
Okay.
Or not?
I mean, what's going to stop us is quite an interesting question. Lots of things could, and it's our job to make sure that they don't. But obviously the first thing that everybody wants to talk about with this is money. We are sticking to our international climate finance commitments. The Prime Minister is anxious that we do that. Everybody knows the decisions that were made around the ODA cuts, but there is no way we could go to Parliament with a proposition that didn't have climate as one of our priorities. So we've got climate, our humanitarian work, and global health, as well as what we do in Gaza and Sudan and Ukraine, as being as protected as you can in this context. But I think, in some ways, the fact that this debate comes to money very, very quickly, I think doesn't always do us any favours, because the public somehow feel that there's money going around the world doing things, and yet they're always told things are getting worse, not better, so they kind of lose faith with the whole agenda. There's also a problem, I think, that we have to be honest with ourselves around language with this, and that I have found some of this really quite impenetrable since being appointed. And I think development has its own sense of language and ways of talking about itself. Climate does as well, and when the two come together, it gets really, really quite difficult. And I think we have to sort of really think about that and work out how we can be more inclusive in the way that we talk about what is the most important political agenda that the world faces, but you wouldn't really have thought so by the way we all sometimes go about it. I think that the way we organise globally our work on climate could be better. It does seem there are so many different funds, so many initiatives, different pots of money, different places with different bits of governance, some of which are trying to do the same sorts of things. It's a bit of a mess, and we need collectively, as a global community, to try and somehow prioritise and organise some of that. We've got COP coming up. I don't know if that will make it better or make it worse. But I think if we carry on the way we are, then there'll be more arguments than there will be solutions found, and we can't really afford to carry on like that anymore. I look at some of the leadership now that we're seeing from countries like Brazil and South Africa, really wanting to be champions, and I think one of the things that the UK can do is to not get in the way of that and to try and support that. So Brazilians have got their Forest Forever fund that they want to launch at COP. It's not perfect. There are things that they probably wouldn't have done it that way, those kinds of things. We've got to work with them to make this work. So where we think that the fund might be too small, where we think that it would be directed, let's get in there and try and support the Brazilians so they can have a win. because I just think this can't be something. Yes, the UK has shown tremendous leadership, and we've got to continue to do that. But better than having us as being we are global leaders is having shared leadership across the world, so other people feel pride in that, in the ability to move this forward. I think sometimes as well, I think we need to work with our partners. So we have these Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and we're trying to work with South Africa, Indonesia, try and get them past coal and get them onto renewables, other energy sources. And we can get very frustrated that other countries aren't doing what we do or what we did. I'm from Teesside, and I lived through what we did, and I can totally understand why the trade unionist president of South Africa looks at that and says, I'm not doing that to my population, and I fully respect him for that position. We underprice domestic politics in this country, and definitely in other countries, and we need to learn how to work with trade union movements across the world to secure those jobs and give livelihoods to populations that will be very hard hit if we do this in the wrong way. And if we want to do it in the wrong way, it just won't happen. So that's part of there's more to this than just money. Like, you can throw all the money you want at the government of South Africa, it's not going to make that change if it's going to throw a large part of its population into unemployment or into work that's insecure, lacking the identity that's associated with those jobs in the energy industry. But it's really urgent, and I know that other people in the panel will remind us of this. They'll remind us, I hope, Philip, that the people who are hardest hit are children. This causes displacement of people. Many of the things, as Laura says, that people in this country get angry about, like food prices and a whole bunch of other issues, you can trace back to climate shocks in other parts of the world. So this is urgent. A slight note of optimism, and I think we don't get enough optimism, and that's part of the reason that sometimes the public disengage, is that before the Paris Agreement, we were on track for a 4-degree warming. You know, we're not where we want to be by a long way. There's a huge amount to do, but that did make a difference, and we've got to allow ourselves to be a little bit proud and acknowledging of progress that's been made, and we need to tell the public that what they've done and some of the changes that they've made have been good. Because that, in my experience, I did a psychology degree a very, very long time ago, but there is such a thing as positive reinforcement as well as telling people we're all going to die. So I kind of think that that's part of what we need to do as well. And you know, I worry that unless we do some of these things, that we'll lose public support, then we lose power. You know, governments that care about this end up not being in government anymore, and then where do we go? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jamie.
Laura? Baroness? Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. So we have 2 years until the UK hosts a group of 20 world leaders in this country. 2 years is not very long. Shortly after that, we have the next comprehensive spending review, where we set out our big budget cycle. So these are the things around which we need to get organised so that we make the case for both development and climate finance in the round. By the way, can I just ask, how many people are wearing an SDG pin in the tent? I saw one. Thank you very much at the back there. I am also wearing one. One is excused because you've got it covered with your pin. I say that because that is where we once agreed 10 years ago that climate and development would marry and meet, and people and planet would get organised together in a partnership. And subsequently, sadly, that did not happen. And we can blame 2016 and Brexit and Trump for confusing us all and demoralising partnerships between countries to some degree, especially from this country. But climate and development did not get organised properly together, continued too much in their silos, and exactly as you said, we perpetrated these acronyms and idiosyncrasies and ways of talking and working that kept things apart. That has to stop. We have to actually listen to the countries at the front lines of poverty and climate change, extreme poverty and extreme climate change, who want organised partnership across the two and with humanitarian. And also they want organised partnership with public and private sector. And we have to get out of our various silos and specialisms and special interest groups and try and coordinate. And that's very much what sharing strategies has been about for those who are interested in collective intelligence for people and planet. I say all of that because I spent a lot of time worrying about the phrase climate finance, and I think to some extent I still do. You know, I want more of it, let's be clear, and much better quality of it, and more grants, less loans, less financial complex engineering, and more clarity. But I prefer it to be called sustainable development finance, or something which marries the two, because from the country's point of view, if we keep these things all in these separate spigots, it is such a nightmare for them to coordinate and to harness for their development and climate strategies. What we need is an international development finance system that is climate smart. Right? And that is something we need to strive for. Now, how do we get there? It's always easier when there's more money on the table. And that is not where we are in terms of concessional finance, because of very regretful decisions that we made by this government and many others around the world. There is, however, a very positive agenda we can work on together, and that is around financial system innovation. Now, be cautious about what I'm about to say, because some of it is real, some of it may be real, and some of it definitely is not real. And it is very hard to tell which is which. It's very hard to compare apples and oranges and grapes, or sultanas. I mean, it is extremely complex. So, for example, with regard to the Tropical Forest Forever facility that President Lula is championing, he is asking all of our countries to partner with them in Brazil and tropical forest holding countries in a lot of use of guarantees. Now, there are good guarantees, there are bad guarantees, and there are guarantees that I couldn't tell you whether they're good or not, because it's unclear, because the data is not very good, and our experience of using them isn't very long. So we're going to need those in the tent, and I think from LSE at the back there, Paul here from one, I know, and others, are trying to make sure that we as a sector, or should I say sectors, become smarter in that element of climate and development finance that is to do with guarantees. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I start talking about guarantees, please look them up, and let's get literate and numerate about how these will be used by governments around the world, leveraging more public and private finance into solving some of these global public good investment cases. Because we need much more creative use of the money, the scarce money that we have from the public side, and the huge amounts of money we have on the private side that are not properly put to work. And guarantees are probably going to be a major tool of public policy to unlock this. We need to get clear on what is a good one, what is a bad one. I hope I've made that point. And if you're not clear what the point is, I hope that's made the point you need to get clear. So guarantees, let's do some homework. And there are some in the room who are offering their support and help to others in the room about what we should be looking for. We'll probably hear a lot more about this at the annual meetings and the COP in Berlin. So watch this space. There's a lot of work that has to happen on debt and cost of capital beyond that. The good news on debt is there is an emerging solution set. So these countries would like to borrow better and on longer term low interest rates than they currently are able to. And we need to reorganize our global public financial system and our private finance system so they can do so, and restructure some extremely bad quality debt into some better quality debt in the longer term. And this is something that, so I come from a background of campaigning on debt cancellation, which is quite a difficult thing for debt campaigners to get their head around, because we prefer it where there no or very limited debt. What we're going to have to get good at is campaigning for high quality, low interest, and very transparent terms debt. Because these investments are highly worthwhile. They're incredibly profitable. You know, investing in sustainable infrastructure and energy in emerging economies is an incredibly good idea. But finally, of course, we need much more adaptation finance, for the vast majority of which there is no obvious or immediate return on investment. And that is where we need to concentrate our scarce ODA. And I think that is where the climate development and humanitarian finance kind of divisions have done us all a disservice. and perhaps scarce ODA has gone to the wrong places, or the less efficient or less urgent places when there are other parts of the ecosystem crying out with people dying for lack of resources, while some other places are getting that scarce ODA that probably could have been done better by long-term loans or the private sector. And we need to be much more intellectually honest with ourselves about that allocation of resources. I think that is something which, because of these regretful cuts, we're going to have to get much better. We should always have been better organised on this, but we're going to have to get much better organised on it now. In the very short term, we need, as Jenny said, refugee costs down, money for actual overseas finance. But please, let's all get our heads around debt, cost of capital guarantees, other measures which are going to reduce the cost of capital for these countries so they can invest in their green growth and jobs. Maybe just finally, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria, amongst others, is an extremely important mechanism. One of the things I worry about in the development climate sort of division in our heads is that something like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria is not seen as a climate finance mechanism. Helping the poorest people on the planet not have to deal with AIDS, TB, and malaria is a great way to help them be resilient and adapt to climate change. And not being sick, not being poor, these are great ways to be in a situation where you can adapt and be resilient. So it's a good example of how I hope the climate finance campaigners could see a health finance mechanism and see it as part of their cause, because it absolutely is. Certainly from the point of view of that girl or woman in Mali or Malawi, who needs that partnership from us and doesn't see these things as, oh, that's the climate people, or that's the development people. It's the same thing.
Thank you so much. Svetlana.
When a child's classroom floods in Mozambique or a 9-year-old in London dies from air pollution, what becomes clear is that climate change is our reality and that it directly impacts the lives of children and young people. Yet climate finance often neglects this truth. Last year was COP30, which was the climate finance COP, and yet again the needs of young people and children were left behind. UNICEF's research evidences that children who live in countries that face the brunt of climate change lose their rights to food, to water, to education, to a healthy development, and often these countries emit the least. Then in the UK, we had our hottest summer on record, water scarcity is increasing, and in the devastating case of Ella, we have a 9-year-old who becomes the first case in the UK whose death was reported as due to air pollution. So what we know is that in every scenario, across every geography, children and young people are amongst the most vulnerable due to climate change. Therefore, every pound that we don't spend halting the climate crisis or with children and young people at heart, it will have disastrous consequences, not just for the imminent future, but also for the far future. Though I applaud the Labour government's effort with the 11.6 billion International Climate Finance Fund and the goal to triple adaptation funding by 1.5 billion by 2025. However, these finances need to be designed with children and young people at heart, whether that is through building climate resilient schools or scaling institutions that focus on young people's health, or making water access more clearer, or even making clear pathways towards climate related jobs. And this needs to be done both internationally and domestically. Therefore, my first ask is that children and young people are made explicit in UK climate finance, understanding how it will be allocated and reported towards children and young people's needs, and not just as a vulnerable group, but as a priority. Also, my second ask involves youth inclusion. A lot of climate movements currently are led by young people, such as the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and young people want just and equitable futures. And that is because as young people, we understand that we're inheriting the catastrophe of today. So when we talk about adaptation and mitigation, we're talking about the environmental and socio-economic reality that young people will become adults in. And yet youth inclusion and policy decision making is underfunded and unclear. So this is an opportunity for the UK to show climate leadership and establish formally a UK Youth Climate Council. This provides young people the opportunity to feed into domestic and international policy concerning climate finance. And it also understands that children need to have voices at COP and at home, and not just in a tokenistic way, but in a way that recognises the lived experience, the knowledge and the drive young people have to shape our futures. And if Denmark, Poland, Ghana and Ireland can establish youth climate councils, then there's no reason that the UK cannot do the same. Lastly, climate change should be ring-fenced within the ODI to protect it from political shifts. I think that we can learn from the suddenness and the ongoing impact of USAID cuts, and we can learn from the current UK political reality where trust is being lost and safety no longer feels guaranteed. This finance is supposed to help us deal with the greatest issue of our lifetime, and therefore it needs to be protected. However, if this is the case, then transparency within the ODA needs to be incredibly clear, and it needs to be clear how this climate finance is directly impacting children and young people. This November will be COP30, which is 30 years, 3 decades of having COPs trying to see what ways we can create policies to have children in mind. Yet from the first COP to COP30, children have now become adults. The needs of women and children are still unmet. If billions of people are unrecognised in these climate summits, then the truth is something has to change. Therefore, I call on the UK government to champion a financing goal that will close the $1 trillion gap and make women's rights central to that ambition. Though the UK has shown ambition when it does concern climate finance, this is also a case of moral leadership. Every pound that is spent on children and young people's rights recognises that this is not just for the most vulnerable of today, but also for the generations to follow.
The short straw speaking after everyone else. I'm trying to sort of adjust what I'm going to say to what everyone else has already said. I'm trying not to repeat too much. So I think it is, as the Minister said, it's important to acknowledge where we have made progress, and acknowledging progress is important. But we've also said that urgency is needed, and this is a topic of which we can't wait. We've said that focus is required, and whilst we can say people will immediately go to money, money is a proxy for focus, and allocation within those budgets is key as well. So thinking about allocation is fundamental. The UNICEF UK, our core mission is supporting and promoting the rights and needs of children. We were set up by the UN with a mandate to support the delivery of and advocate for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And as Svetlana has said, the climate crisis is a child rights crisis. There's nearly half the world's population, nearly a billion children, live in countries at extremely high risk of climate events. And as Svetlana has said, those range from impact on malnutrition, impact on education. 1 in 7 children were out of school last year because of extreme climate events. That's something like 15% of the world's population were out of school. I think that the challenge for us really is that where the government has made a big commitment to climate spend, and that's to be applauded. And it is important to recognise that the Labour government has committed to climate spend and also to be a global leader. So it's important to speak about partnerships, but also important to be a leader and to step forward. I think it's important that the UK is stepping forward and not sitting on the side of things. The challenge then is really around climate finance, as we've said, and where that goes. So with children bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change, it's really important to look at how that climate finance is spent. So this year, UNICEF UK published a report to look at how international climate finance was spent over the last 6 years. So in 2018, just over 17% of climate finance was child-focused. So 17% of all the climate finance that the UK was spending. In 2023, that had halved to 9%. And now only 1% of the UK's bilateral climate finance spending is going towards education and health. And yet those are two sectors that are enormously important for children and are hugely impacted by the climate crisis. So in terms of what we're asking for in terms of the allocation and the focus, it's important that both children are integrated into the strategy. So at the moment, children are not in the climate finance strategy. They're mentioned only in terms of context, not in terms of their vulnerability. It's really important that children are at the heart of a climate finance strategy. And that's important because it means that money goes to the right places to make the biggest difference. And I suppose that, you know, for us, what we would ask for is that actually 25% of that ODA that's focused on climate finance is ring-fenced for child-focused climate funding. And I think it's really important that we think about where those finances are allocated and how they're allocated, and how young people and children are included in both the strategy and the delivery.
Thank you so much. So I've really appreciated both the sobering picture that we've got from some of those contributions. One out of 7 children being out of school last year due to extreme climate events is a really shocking statistic. So the sense of optimism and that we have made progress and that we can continue to make. As you said, COP29 was meant to be the finance COP. It wasn't. It was sort of rescued at the last minute with a sort of plan on to COP30. So I'd like to hear everybody's assessment of how optimistic do you feel that COP30 can be a step forward in terms of meeting the climate finance challenge? And is there one action that you individually or organisationally are going to be focusing on to push that COP30 as far as possible in terms of what it can achieve? Minister.
I mean, COP is not an outcome, right? And I sometimes I hear the points about you've got to allocate this much to that, and you've got to you've got to tag this spending as that. These are all input targets, and I think one of the things that's bedeviled this agenda for a very long time is that we spend too much of our attention on those things and not enough attention on what's actually getting done. You know, most of the money that is going to be found for international climate finance over the next 10 years is not going to come from ODA or governments. It's going to come from the private sector. We have to do everything we can, using guarantees and mechanisms as well, there are lots of them, to get that money. There's $255 trillion sitting on public markets going nowhere near developing economies. Those people who control that money are starting to say to us, we're interested. We can see that there's opportunity in energy transition in developing economies. Now that money might not be tagged as a child-centred programme, but that money will do a lot more to get Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam off coal, off renewables, and it will make money in the process, and it will provide jobs, and it will secure energy sovereignty for those countries. That to me is, like, if you're going to do one thing to help us to get closer to our climate change targets, that's the agenda. The UK's got a huge amount to offer this. We've got the City of London, we've got the expertise, we've got our diplomatic network, we've got our development spending, we've got our defence spending, which is relevant to this as well. We've got to start thinking about this thing holistically, stop sort of siloing it off and fetishising it in one little part of a couple of departments. There is no climate strategy across government in a way that's meaningful when it comes to ODA spending. We've got to join this up. It's unacceptable that DESNES, DEFRA, FCEO spending this money in a way that's completely how that's been allowed to happen, just it's appalling. We're going to fix that. As far as COP's concerned, I want to see the UK in the shape of Ed Miliband standing there saying, look what we've done in our country. We've closed our last remaining coal mine. And I had it out with it. I'm from the north of England, so I had a lot to say to him at the time about this. But he's right, you know, and we've got to stand there and show that we've done this, and it's actually good for your economy, and the growth in our economy is coming from the renewable sector and from things that combat climate change. So we've got to show that. we've also got to understand where other countries are. And one of the most important things we can do is work with our insurance industry to make sure that when a country invests in the new school, or the new infrastructure, or the flood defences, that it's built to a really high quality. You can't do that if you can't insure it. So too much of our insurance at the moment, when disaster hits, it takes months, if not years, to get payout. We can change that by having insurance that's triggered by the event and not by the damage, so you don't need to go through that process. And then you get to that country and that community within days or weeks. That's possible. It's happening in about 5% of cases. At the moment, we need to get that up to around a third. So there are things that I would like to see discussed at COP. The other thing I'd like to one of the really brilliant things the Brazilians are doing with this COP is around indigenous communities, and they are making sure that they have a real voice and they're able to lead in Belém. And that's something that I don't think we've properly seen before. That will include young people, but it will include people who are probably the most marginalised on the planet, living in very remote communities, will be given a platform and a voice. And you can't save the forest, and you can't prevent climate change without being properly inclusive and allowing everybody to have their voice and their stake properly heard and understood.
Thank you very much. No, thank you. Jamie.
I know we're tight on time, but so right now we have a sort of reverse Marshall Plan going on, as I think President Lula put it in Seville, because of bad terms of trade, high costs of capital, interest rates that are onerous, illicit financial flows, and aid cuts. We have the Global South, in a sense, subsidising the Global North across these issues when we should be dramatically in reverse. Whereas, in fact, we should be advocating, and some of us have been, for a modern-day Marshall Plan for people, planet, and hope. And that's what many Global South leaders have been calling for some time. The point about this, though, is it's not simply one big ODA grant check. It's a reorganising of how the international that is in our common interest. Right now, it is not even the UK's, or France's, or the United States. That probably is in the United States' interest. But it's not in anyone else's interest. And we need to reorganise it together. And we need the UK, above all, to be an activist shareholder in the international financial system. Jenny, as a governor on the World Bank, for example, to be a shareholder at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, play that role, please. And I believe you are and will. So that is like preeminent above so many other things. Specifically for Belém, President Lula has been clear. He wants support for the Tropical Forest Forever facility and views the success of his summit as whether or not the world has turned up for him on that, and turned up for the indigenous people of the Amazon and around the world in similar situations or not. So that is a very clear indicator. But can I just repeat my first point about the G20 in 2 years' time? The G20 in the UK in 2 years' time, please put it in your calendars, coincides within 1 week of a COP in Africa. COP 32 will be in Africa, either Nigeria, South Africa, or possibly Ethiopia. So the UK will be hosting the World Summit of the G20 leaders at the same time as Africa, essentially at the same time as Africa hosts the Global Climate Summit. We've got that 2 years to figure this out. And if this country can't work with partners around the world to figure that out in that 2 years, I think we are lost. We have a parliamentary majority, we have a Labour government, we have activist shareholders on the board of the World Bank, we've got financial wizardry in London that does need to be held accountable and pointed in the right direction. And we've got an amazing, vibrant civil society that needs to remember and find its mojo again. And put pressure on our policymakers and the holders of private capital to get organised. And it is up to us. So we've got that 2 years in partnership with our colleagues across the world and in Africa to get this right. I'm really excited about it, but we should also be daunted by that timeline and get really organised.
Fantastic, thank you. Svetlana.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, it's 30 years old for COP, and I think we can recognise and understand that there's some issues within the way that COP exists. I think if we want to have sustained change that isn't existing in silos, we have to think about how can we reform COP in a way that brings all actors into decision making. So for example, when we talk about the green transition, how do we also recognise that there's particular minerals that we will depend on that impact countries in the global south? How can we make sure that the actors that will be mining those minerals aren't in conditions where exploitation is existing, so that when we talk about global justice, it's not justice for the few but for everyone. And that also exists when we're talking about vulnerable groups. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where small-scale farmers are experiencing drought and water scarcity, that means that young girls are having to be married off so the family can have money, but also they're walking 15 kilometers a day to be able to fetch water, and that makes them vulnerable to violence. So when we're talking about climate finance, how can we understand the intersections to some young people? How can we understand the intergenerational differences as well to serve not just young people but also elders who are also vulnerable in the UK due to rising heat levels? To silos, how can we make sure we're not existing in silos? At UK Youth Climate Coalition, we also focus on conflict of interest. So how can we make sure that we create policies so that when we enter COP, it isn't being infiltrated by fossil fuel lobbyists? So we have to think of ways that can make sure that what we say lives up to what we do. And that's important when we talk about COP30.
Thank you very much.
Again, I'll try not to repeat anything that's been said. I mean, I suppose the key thing for us from the top, from a UNICEF UK perspective, is that the discussions are child-centred as the most vulnerable group. I think just to add something in addition, I think that we can't take away the role of governments in terms of if you look at the private sector. You've mentioned Minister around supply chains. I was in Hungary last week with various big supermarkets. One of the things they're worried about is supply chain vulnerability. So this is a real concern for the private sector. But there is the failure of the comments, which private sector companies can invest significant money in isolation. So there is a challenge for us in terms of convening, converging and catalysing. And this is the role of governments and of multilateral institutions. And we've really got to focus on how do we mobilise those private sector actors to release funding and finance to guarantee supply chains to build more resilient systems. So I think that's an opportunity for us and something we should be thinking about. I know from those discussions that private sector companies are worried, they are concerned, they're trying to think about it. But even for those multinationals, it's not enough for them to act on their own, nor do they want to invest for competitors to gain advantage. So it's about building that, convening, converging and catalysing.
Right, let's open up to the room. Who has a question for our panel? So go back there, and then here, and then there.
From Australia. My question is around the role of civil society in bolstering and supporting governments by getting the public on side for some of the things they're asking of government. So how does, open to the panel, how does your organisations think about gaining public support or neutralising a lack of public support to give government the confidence to be able to do more, whether it's on ODI or even thinking about the private sector as well. And some things the Minister was talking about getting private capital in there as well. What role does the panel think it is to do in building public support for greater investment in climate finance?
Great. Definitely.
Thanks very much. Selena Victor from Muzzy. Thank you. I couldn't agree more about the diagnosis of the problem of the complexity and the sort of nonsense of the international finance system. It's incredibly challenging and a huge waste of resources. But one additional letter that didn't come up was we work with communities who are completely devastated by both climate change and conflict. And because definitions and categorisation and targeting has all taken separate definitions, that gets lost. We have made huge progress at the last COP. How do we make sure we keep making progress and make sure that those communities who are suffering the most and are least responsible are actually still addressed within these innovative climate finance systems that actually many of them will not work in those communities?
Thank you. Judy from important to raise. My question is around international climate finance for, and it was obviously very reassuring to hear that the UK government is very committed to prioritising priorities from global south governments and to the current ICF, but it's obviously about to run out. And it's running out at a time when all the governments around the world are resubmitting their climate priorities in their national climate plans. I was wondering if you were able to share any glimpse of information either in terms of when we could expect ICF4 to be announced and any information about its scale and how it's planning on matching the ambition that we're seeing in the priorities in the climate plans that are being submitted. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Should we take the questions in the order of our panel, and then we'll try and do another round and go backwards? So, next, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, how to build public support, please, somebody figure this out. We've got a session later today which Maureen Common are leading, where I'm hoping we can kind of, I mean, EP as a fantastic stuff. And I'm really looking forward to that. I mean, I've got some ideas, I don't know if I'm right. I know the voters of Darlington incredibly well, and where I know the voters of Bristol less well. So, with all humility, I think this is a shared challenge that we need to kind of work together on, and I'm looking forward to doing that. You're absolutely right about conflict. I worry about this all the time. It's very, very difficult to sit with traumatised people on the border of Sudan and start talking about climate. You know, they kind of, you know, there's a sort of hierarchy of needs thing that kicks in. It's just human. You want to feed people, you want to give them healthcare, you want to give them support to their trauma. But you cannot ignore the intersectionality of all of these things. And one of the things that I think we've let ourselves down with is not properly understanding just how interconnected all of these issues are, and how climate shock leads to conflict, conflict leads to lack of resilience. All of these things lead to violence, poor health, displacement. All of the things that we are trying to tackle together. So, no, I don't have any easy answers. If I told you what our ICF commitment was going to be and when it was going to be announced, I'm probably fired. So, I'm not going to do that, but yeah, I'm pleased where we've got to. But just to sort of make the point again, our ICF commitment is one thing, but we will use it to leverage way more money than the ICF commitment itself into this agenda. That's where that's the secret, the magic of what we want to try and do. And you know, we've been very successful at that in the past, but I think we need to take what we've learned and really move a lot faster with it, because we can get a lot more money than our commitment into developing countries for this.
Great, Jamie.
I mean, in terms of making the case to the public, one thing I would say is that a clear ask with a clear baddie and a clear outcome always works for campaigning. Private planes, kerosene, very rich people, underpaid taxes on their planes, private planes. That feels like a good one to go further on. It might be economic populism, some other thing, but I think unlocking a bit more there and making the case about political pays principles through that, I think could be a very handy way of unlocking some additional grant financing, which is highly scarce. That's a highly tactical thing, could unlock the door potentially for a more public permission to do more. In terms of persuading the public, I would actually turn to Richard Darlington and the Aid Alliance in the corner of there, also called Darlington. You know, a lot of expertise locked up in some of these organisations and networks that spend every Saturday in town halls up and down the country actually talking to people and getting from local pain points and concerns through to international issues, through the complex process of deep listening to what's going on, and then enabling the conversation to international. I think a problem that, if you like, us internationalists do is we pitch up in places and bang on and berate immediately about global humanitarian internationalist issues without hearing going through the local. And all our greatest work of campaigns and movements were based on building solidarism from the local to the global. And I think the highly professionalised internationalist sector has forgotten that muscle memory and that skill set of linking the local to the international global. And I think that's something we just need to get better at and more organised around. You asked about ICF4. I've heard some extraordinary and highly ambitious asks from the Climate Action Network. I think they're asking for 5 trillion, of which the UK's contribution is 50 billion per annum. this is an ambitious ask. If anyone in the room is familiar with how that was calculated, they're welcome to explain. But I thought someone should mention that that is in fact an ask from the sector, and we should think about how that sort of thing lands in terms of policymakers hearing that in the midst of being told that no overseas aid is a good idea. Us coming along, some of our sector coming along with those kinds of asks, and how that lands and how that gets negotiated in the political process, and what does that do to the kinds of people who are asking for that, is a conversation we need to have with ourselves a little bit more. I hope this key point about breaking down between climate and development has been clearly understood and made. The best way that gets done is by properly empowering people within these countries to demand of our system what they need, rather than us encrusting ourselves in these silos and then telling them that's how it's going to be. And to your point on humanitarian, that's the way around that. And the best interventions humanitarian often are those best for climate interventions and best development interventions and best gender equality interventions.
Super. Svetlana.
Yeah, so when it comes to civil society, I think that's why I talk about establishing a UK Youth Climate Council, because that can serve as a bridge, especially for you, to be able people who are working towards climate. They're working through different ways, whether that is through farmers, disability rights, migrants' rights. But in order to come together, there needs to be a body that can serve as a bridge. And that I think is important to also have public support and have a way of communicating what's happening to feel like the government is doing something towards justice. Because if there is a clear pathway to communicate that, that's when climate disinformation can grow, or people can feel like this party isn't serving, for example. And when it comes to conflict, I think that's a really good point. I was speaking to a health coordinator from Kenya who was saying drought and water access is causing conflict in Kenya. The same between small scale and commercial farmers in Zambia. And even when we talk about Sudan and when we talk about the conflict in the Middle East, what we're seeing that displacement can cause rapid urbanization, which then becomes a climate problem, which then creates climate change. So I think it's also a case of, again, when the topic of conflict feels siloed from climate issues, that can mean that the needs that needs to be addressed aren't being addressed. But how can we experience the knowledge from NGOs that are working on the ground to be able to bring them into decision-making rooms and argue the case that when we talk about climate finance, we need to talk about conflict. But if they're left out of those rooms and out of those integral spaces, then we're not able to make those connections, so that when we do go to COP, we talk about all the intersections as silos, when eventually, if we understand it too late, we'll understand those intersections when vulnerable groups are too late to be helped.
Thank you. Philip.
I'll be quick again, as we're running out of time. I think on the first question around global support for ODA and international work, I mean, there's two things. One, for UNICEF UK, we focus on child rights here in the UK and internationally, so that connection here and there, I think, is really important. But to be honest, the most successful defence of international spend is successful domestic policy. Really, the alienation around ODA comes from marginalisation and vulnerability in the UK. It doesn't come from actually resentment around the international spend. There is no problem with spending 99.3% of our budget in the UK if we go with marginalisation and vulnerability here. So that 0.7% or 0.5% or 0.3% is really due to the failure of domestic policy. So let's deal with domestic policy and make sure then we're able to make the case at the same time for the fact that actually it's really important for the UK that we do spend 0.7% on international development. It doesn't matter about the sum of money, but it's about a whole range of things that are important for the UK. It's important for UNICEF UK perspective that child rights are met. It's also important for self-power, we know that. So, and on the point about conflict and climate, they are absolutely interlinked. I've spent a long time working across the dry zones of the Sahel. Conflict and climate absolutely interlinked. The same thing, essentially.
Thank you. I'm feeling the minister may have to depart.
I've got two in conversation why I'm the only guest of updates. I've been rude.
Do you need to go now, or can we sneak in one or two more quick questions?
I'm feeling like I'm already.
Okay.
It started at 10.
Okay, we'll let you go, in which case, we can do another 10 minutes just with the rest of the panel as we've got another 9 minutes. Thank you so much. Yes. Do we have more points or questions? Here? Anyone else? Let's take yours.
Hi, I'm David Hillman, Director of Staff and Poverty. Thanks to all the speakers on the panel and to the Minister. The Reinvest Plus initiative, I don't know if you've heard of that, masterminded by our National Solid Architects of the Bridgetown Initiative, announced last week at New York Climate Week, will be an important announcement at COP30, and it's of a credible plan to raise the extra $1 trillion needed for climate action, specifically renewables, along the lines of the Baku-to-Berlin roadmap that you mentioned. And it's about creatively crowding money at scale into the space, and I wondered if you are aware of the initiative and what your view of it is.
Was it the long tree?
No, I wasn't there. Please.
Look, Baroness is brilliant, and I am happy to subscribe to almost all of his proposals and ideas. So I think, yes, I think we should be in. Anything can unlock that trillion. So for those not familiar, in the Baku to Berlin roadmap and in the NCQG process, it is proposed that we unlock 1.3 trillion per annum additional by 2035, of which 300 billion in theory is public finance, and 1 trillion the gap is to be unlocked from domestic resources and international private finance. If you split that half and half, that's about $500 billion a year that needs to be unlocked from international private finance. And Baroness, who I do think is very good at these things, believes that this Reinvest Plus, which is being piloted through the Inter-American Development Bank, is a way to do this. However, it's a new idea. The markets need to understand it, I think, and the people who manage these assets need to believe in it. So there needs to be some quite aggressive piloting. You can't go, you have to go from 0 to some sort of speed before you get to 100, and I don't quite know how that's going to happen. But where our is concerned, I'm signing up.
Philip, what's going on here? Great.
You'll be very happy that you made that point, David.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of the Chamber of Commerce in East Lancashire, so that sounds a strange connection. But I'm the British Chambers of Commerce Climate League, and we run a low carbon tech innovation agency that's trying to get tech to answer the questions. So we're efficient observers, and we sit on a thing called the Climate Technology Centre and Network, which is part of UNICEF. And systems need to be improved to make it all, because the Climate Technology Centre and Network has got a very small number of to get tech to answer UN challenges, and that system isn't working to even get those little tranches of £250,000 to get tech into countries. So then when we look at the very big COP, this will be my fifth, and you look at the sort of siloed systems of finance and just transition and technology deployment, it's very frustrating that you can't see easy pathways to how we can use the public sector funding to unlock the technologies to be free without intellectual property constraints, to go like we did with vaccines to countries, and then the private sector funding to actually set up the manufacturing for those technologies in those countries. So it's an economic development gain. But it just feels like we can't do small things practically. How the heck are we going to do the big things? Thank you.
Down front here.
Paul Cook from the One Campaign. Just a quick point on sort of climate finance and scale of ambition. So as I mentioned on the panel earlier, there's some very ambitious numbers. But just recognise those are numbers coming out of the Global South and the communities of the Global South and civil society in the Global South. And they are morally the right numbers. That is the kind of scale we're looking at. That is what's kind of needed. If you're sat there in those communities, that does feel what's needed. Of course, that's then got to clash into political realities in the UK about what's doable, what's winnable, what's achievable, and we've got to find some way through between those two poles. So I just would love, we haven't talked a lot in this panel about, fossil fuel subsidies, levies, you can talk about, frequent flyers and all that stuff, and those feel like areas where we could really push into and see more. Obviously, from the government's point of view, they're terrified of making the market and the city nervous. So I guess, what's your brilliant idea for how we convince the government that there is room?
It's not easy. Because I mean, there's huge vested interest, and I mean, it's trying to find ways in which. So it's interesting. So we're trying to unlock financial scale. So there's an initiative which the UK government is involved with UNICEF around today, which is around payments, actually about investment in building resilience, guaranteed payouts, for example, in South Africa. So those are some examples of how you unlock some finance transition. So transition is not my subject, but certainly around mitigation and adaptation, there are mechanisms. And again, it's trying to convince more private sector and governments to be involved. So that's actually an initiative from the German government and the UK government. Whether the UK government, it's a success story, whether the UK government will continue, the minister's not here so we can't ask her, whether they'll continue that, but trying to ramp up those things around, particularly around mitigation and investment resilience. And one of the challenges around conflict I've always found is that, particularly when you go to governments, they're looking for outcomes, and you can't describe when people are not impacted. It's very difficult. People haven't died, and that conflict hasn't happened. It's sort of like, here's a success story, there's no conflict. Here's a success story, people didn't die because of climate disaster. It doesn't really work very easily. And actually how we invest to make sure things don't happen is really important. I don't know whether anyone wants to say anything about markets and transition.
I mean, the one thing I'd say that is maybe we haven't talked about it all here is that there was a piece of research that came out 2 weeks ago from Tim Sahay, a team at Brown University, who've been crunching China's investments, and everyone knows what China's doing on domestic and solar and wind and so on. So even while they're still increasing coal, but their investments overseas into emerging market renewable infrastructure at this point in adjusted prices exceeds the United States investment in the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. There is a dramatic, phenomenal, transformative investment going on into energy infrastructure in emerging markets by China right now. And so I don't want to avoid your question, but it's funny how that is not being talked about very much here, but it is being talked about in the Global South. This is what's actually happening. Whereas we're having conversations about, our profound regret and shame at having cut aid. They're getting on and making lots of money for Chinese companies and building economies for emerging markets. And so that these countries can grow and pay their own taxes, so they can pay their own healthcare and adapt and be resilient themselves. And so there's a different model going on, which we are not sufficiently participating in. Now, yes, we do owe. It is right and just, and we should compensate for the damages done. And we have to find a better way to make Lucas Petty the t-shirt that David is wearing. And we should keep working on that. But let's not get ourselves out of the conversation about how dynamic, vibrant industry that we need at home could also be part of this global green growth story that's going to build economies, create good jobs, and help us all be resilient to extremism because our communities cohere and there is a future. That's got to be an equal and important part of the story. But I don't know how we're going to persuade, the can 5 trillion number occurs unless we have extremely confident economic growth, high tax receipts, people feeling very secure about their future. I think that is the order of things, probably.
I don't know. I guess for me, I would say from a different perspective, the best way to persuade people is to tell a good story. I think we can learn a lot from net zero and how that's been to communicate and how that's been. A lot of people switch off after particular comments can be made, for example. So I think especially when it comes to making polluters pay or the impact of fossil fuel and lobbyists and things like that, it's like how do you tell a story that ensures that people, everyday people, feel like they have to push forward and want to push forward, and that in doing so you secure their future. Because I think right now the temperature in the UK is a lot of people don't feel secure. They don't know what is in front of them. They don't know who to blame for that lack of security. And I think that a lot of climate insecurity, you can point where it's come from, the history behind that, but the way it's communicated isn't as strong as the story itself. So I think that's something to think about and to reflect on how to build that strong story. And then when it comes to like the funding and what you said, I agree. I think, I said again, COP's been here for 30 years. I think maybe in an ideal world, like head of delegations and the people that make a difference will come together and eventually talk about COP reform and why COP reform is important. Because even people who have the access and the funding to make change, the pathways are so slow that by the time that change seems clear, the devastation has already happened. And I don't think civil society has a strong enough voice, even though we have the evidence to actually make that change. It's actually the head of delegations, etc., who have to understand that if they advocate for everyone else, it doesn't change their position, it doesn't change their power, it strengthens global power.
Interesting, I've had a quick word with Baroness Chapman yesterday. And she's sort of interested in the financial engineering stuff, which is why she's asking that question. I would like to go through it first. But she agreed to have a meeting. And so I think that